This lesson is logic. We're going to talk about Venn diagrams, how they overlap, and the use of the words all, some, and none. And then we're going to talk about the law of detachment and the law of syllogism. So with Venn diagrams, they show relationships between different sets of data. They can represent conditional statements as well. And they're usually drawn as a circle. Every point in the circle belongs to that set, and every point out of the circle does not. So if you have this example, this is a circle that represents dogs. Item A is a poodle. Well, since a poodle is a dog, then item A is inside the circle. Item B is a horse. Since a horse is not a dog, then item B is outside the circle. Another way to represent item B is the not symbol and then dog. When circles overlap in or not overlap at all, there's different ways that you can represent it. If one circle is completely inside another circle, that means all of the inner circle's items are included in the outer circle's items. If they overlap partly but not completely, then that means you would use the word some. And sometimes, for example, sometimes the circle on the left is in the circle on the right, like right there, but sometimes it's not. This item is in both circles. This item is not. So it sometimes is and sometimes isn't. When items never overlap, then the circles don't have anything to do with one another. None of the items in the first circle match the items in the second circle. Always, sometimes, never, all, some, none. Now let's talk about the law of detachment. The law of detachment involves a true conditional statement, and then a hypothesis occurs. So if P leads to Q, and that's true, and then P happens, well, since P leads to Q, if P happens, then Q happens. The conclusion has to occur. If P leads to Q and P happens, then Q happens. That's what the law of detachment says. If the first thing leads to the second thing, and the first thing happens, then the second thing happens. If you speed on the interstate, you will get a ticket. And then Joe speeds on the interstate, well, Joe is going to get a ticket. That's the law of detachment. Here's another example. If 3 points are collinear, then the points are all on one line. This part of the statement is P, and this part of the statement is Q. And guess what? Points E, F, and G are collinear. Well, P is happening. If P leads to Q and P happens, well, then Q is going to happen. And that means that if E, F, and G are collinear, then E, F, and G are all on one line. If P leads to Q and P happens, then Q happens. Here's another example. If I find $20 in the street, then I'll take you to the movies. On October 10th, I found $20 in the street. Well, this original statement is P leading to Q, and now P is happening. If I find $20 in the street, then I'll take you to the movies. Hey, October 10th, I found $20 in the street. And guess what? That means I am taking you to the movies. So if P leads to Q and P happens, then Q happens. That's the law of detachment. The law of syllogism has two true conditional statements, and the conclusion of the first is the same as the hypothesis of the second. Now that might look a little bit strange the way that's worded, but it's basically like this. If P leads to Q and Q leads to R, so the first thing leads to the second thing, and the second thing leads to the third thing. Well, guess what? That means that the first thing leads to the last thing. One leads to two, two leads to three, so that means that one leads to three. If P goes to Q and Q goes to R, then P goes to R. That's syllogism. Here's an example. If it rains today, then we will not have a picnic. That's the first P to R. Rains today is P, and we will not have a picnic. That's Q. I said P to R a second ago. I meant P to Q. That's P to Q, P leading to Q. Then, if we do not have a picnic, well, look, that's the exact same thing. So Q is happening again. If we do not have a picnic, then we will not see our friends. That's R. If P leads to Q and Q leads to R, then P leads to R. The first thing leads to the third thing. So, if it rains today, then we will not see our friends. That's the conclusion. If P leads to Q and Q leads to R, then P leads to R. If it rains today, then we don't have a picnic. If we don't have a picnic, we don't see our friends. So if it rains today, we don't see our friends. The first leads to the second leads to the third, so the first leads to the third. That's syllogism. Let's write some conclusions here based on the given information. If it is warm, then we will go outside. Well, that's a P leading to Q. Then what? It is warm. Well, P is happening. If P leads to Q and P happens, well, that means that Q has to happen. We will go outside. That's the conclusion. This is detachment. Detachment said if P leads to Q and P happens, then Q happens. And that's exactly what we have here. If it's warm, then we go outside. Well, today it's warm, so today we go outside. If a student studies, then he or she makes a good grade. That is a P leading to Q. Then what happens? Jamie studies. Well, that's another specific way of saying P again. If a student studies, Jamie studies, that's the same thing. So if a student studies, then he or she makes a good grade. Jamie studies. What happens to Jamie? Jamie makes a good grade. That is detachment. The law of detachment. If P leads to Q and P happens, then Q happens. You could also say that Mark studies. Well, that means Mark makes a good grade. If P leads to Q and P happens, then Q happens. Write the conclusion. If two angles form a linear pair, then the two angles are supplementary. That is a P leading to Q. If two angles are supplementary, then the sum of their measures is 180. two angles are supplementary, that's the exact same Q that we just had. So Q, then the sum of their measures is 180. This is a new statement altogether, R. P leads to Q, Q leads to R. Well, that means that P leads to R. So if two angles form a linear pair, then what? Then the sum of their measures is 180. P leads to Q and Q leads to R, so P leads to R. This is the law of syllogism. The first thing leads to the second thing leads to the third, so the first thing must lead to the third. Last example. If an organism is a parasite, then it survives by living on or in a host organism. Well, if an organism is a parasite, that's P, then it survives by living on or in a host organism, that's Q. Then it says if a parasite lives in or on a host organism, then it harms its host. Well, what's the hypothesis here? A parasite lives in or on a host organism? That's the exact same thing that Q just said. So Q is repeating, then it harms its host. That's a whole new idea. So that's R. P leads to Q. Q leads to R. Well, that means that P leads to R. If an organism is a parasite, then goes straight to R. It harms its host. If an organism is a parasite, then it harms its host. P leads to Q, Q leads to R, so P leads to R. This is syllogism. So with Venn diagrams, if one circle is completely inside of another, then it always happens. If circles overlap partly but not everywhere, then it sometimes happens. And if circles don't touch at all, then it never happens. If you have P leading to Q and P happens, then Q happens. That's detachment. And then if P leads to Q and Q leads to R, that means P leads to R. That's syllogism.